The thing about the galaxy, the real, actual, spinning through the void galaxy that most sentient species called home, was that it operated on a fairly predictable set of assumptions. Physics, for instance, remained reliably consistent. Gravity wells behaved themselves. Atmospheric compositions could be calculated with reasonable accuracy. And species, regardless of their evolutionary origin, generally fit into neat little categories that made interstellar commerce and diplomacy considerably less complicated than it might otherwise be. Humanity, as it turned out, had not received the memo about neat little categories. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's establish some context, shall we? Because context, in this particular case, was about to become extremely relevant, particularly to one very unfortunate individual who was about to learn a harsh lesson about assumptions. The Kelbreth Merchant Station hung in the Outer Rim territories like a massive architectural afterthought, all jutting spires and geometric implausibilities that suggested its designers had been either brilliant or severely medicated. Possibly both. It served as a neutral trading hub for approximately 47 different species, each with their own atmospheric requirements, gravitational preferences, and deeply held convictions about proper sanitation protocols. The station's environmental systems worked overtime to maintain the various zones, creating a patchwork of habitable spaces that ranged from comfortably breathable to technically survivable if you don't mind the sulfur. In the grand tradition of such places, Kelbreth Station attracted a particular type of individual: traders, smugglers, mechanics, information brokers, and the occasional optimistic missionary who hadn't yet learned that most species considered aggressive proselytizing a valid reason for airlock ejection. Mira Kowalski fell into the mechanic category, though her official title was Environmental Systems Technician Grade 3, which sounded considerably more impressive than it actually was. Her job primarily involved crawling through access tunnels that were never designed for human proportions, rerouting power conduits when traders overloaded their ship connections, and occasionally explaining to irritated alien merchants why their particular atmospheric requirements couldn't be met simultaneously with 17 other incompatible specifications. She'd been on Kelbreth for 8 months. 8 months of breathing recycled air that tasted vaguely of copper and disappointment. 8 months of meals from the commissary that claimed to be human-compatible, while making no promises about human enjoyable, and 8 months of being the only member of her species on a station that housed roughly 12,000 sentients at any given time. Being a statistical anomaly had its advantages. Mira had discovered that most aliens found humans fascinating, in the same way one might find a particularly clever pet fascinating, interesting to observe, occasionally entertaining, but not to be taken seriously in any meaningful capacity. This suited her fine. She fixed things, collected her credits, and generally kept to herself. The galaxy, meanwhile, had formed some opinions about humanity. These opinions were based on approximately 15 years of contact, a blink of an eye in galactic terms. Barely enough time for the relevant bureaucracies to finish filing the paperwork acknowledging humanity's existence. Earth had been classified as a moderate gravity world, its inhabitants as standard endurance bipeds, and human culture as aggressively curious but essentially harmless. The paperwork, as it happened, contained several significant errors. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Mira's day had started normally enough, which should have been her first warning. Normal days on Kelbreth had a way of deteriorating rapidly, usually around the time someone decided that station regulations were more like friendly suggestions. She'd spent the morning rerouting plasma conduits in Section 7, had a brief but passionate argument with a Vissian dock supervisor about proper cable management, and was looking forward to the end of her shift with the sort of weary anticipation that characterized most of her existence. The commissary occupied a central position in the station's recreational sector, a vast open space where various species could gather to consume nutrition in their preferred format. The humans who designed the station's database had labeled it a food court, which suggested a level of culinary ambition that the reality fell somewhat short of achieving. Still, it was better than eating protein paste in her quarters, and Mira had learned to appreciate the small victories. She'd just collected her meal, something that claimed to be chicken, but was almost certainly a lie when she noticed the commotion near the Draxian trading delegation's table. Now, the Draxians were what galactic society politely termed a warrior culture, and what everyone else called those aggressive jerks with the superiority complex. They'd achieved spaceflight through a combination of impressive engineering and sheer bloody-minded determination, had promptly conquered their 3 nearest neighboring systems, and had then been cordially invited to join galactic civilization with the understanding that further conquest would be frowned upon. They'd agreed, mostly because galactic civilization had some very large guns and a bureaucracy capable of drowning entire civilizations in compliance paperwork. Physically, Draxians were impressive specimens. They averaged 2.5 meters in height, possessed 4 arms ending in taloned hands, and had evolved on a heavy gravity world that made them dense, powerful, and convinced of their own physical superiority. Their culture valued strength above essentially everything else, which made them excellent mercenaries and terrible diplomats. The particular Draxian currently making a scene was named Vorath Tel, and he was having what might charitably be described as a disagreement with one of the station's service workers, a young Felian female, whose species was generally regarded as gentle, compliant, and thoroughly unsuited for confrontation. Mira watched as Vorath loomed over the much smaller alien, his 4 arms gesticulating in what was unmistakably aggressive body language. His voice carried across the commissary, a deep rumbling growl that the translation implants rendered as something about improper service and insufficient respect. The Felian was trembling, her delicate features showing the sort of fear that suggested she was approximately 3 seconds from either bolting or crying, possibly both. Around them, other patrons carefully studied their meals with sudden intense interest. This was the standard response to Draxian aggression. Ignore it. Let it blow over. Don't get involved. Draxians had a reputation, and that reputation strongly discouraged intervention. Mira sighed. She really should have stayed in her quarters. But here was the thing about humans that the galaxy hadn't quite figured out yet. They had a deeply inconvenient tendency toward what their own literature called protagonist syndrome. This manifested as an irrational compulsion to get involved in situations that any sensible species would avoid, usually while muttering something about principles or doing the right thing. Mira was not immune to this species-wide character flaw. She set down her definitely not chicken, straightened her maintenance jumpsuit, and walked over to the confrontation with the resigned air of someone who knew they were about to make a poor life choice, but was committed to seeing it through anyway. "Hey," she said, her translation implant converting her words into galactic standard. "How about you back off and let her do her job?" The commissary, which had been maintaining a low murmur of conversation and clinking utensils, went suddenly, profoundly silent. This was the sort of silence that suggested everyone present was already mentally composing witness statements. Vorath turned slowly, all 4 eyes focusing on this new irritant. When he saw Mira, all 168 centimeters of her, weighing maybe 60 kilograms, soaking wet, something like amusement flickered across his reptilian features. "The human," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I have heard of your species, soft-worlders. Fragile." He pronounced the word fragile with particular relish, as if it were a delicacy he was savoring. "You should return to your meal, little creature. This does not concern you." Mira felt her jaw tighten. She'd been dealing with variations of this attitude since arriving at Kelbreth. The casual dismissal, the assumption of weakness, the implication that humans were somehow less than the established galactic species. It was getting old. "Right," she said. "And you should probably learn some basic manners. I'm guessing they don't teach those on heavy-gravity meathead worlds, but it's never too late to start." The commissary's silence intensified, which shouldn't have been physically possible but somehow was. Someone near the back made a sound that might have been a stifled gasp or possibly a prayer. Vorath's amusement vanished, replaced by something considerably less pleasant. He straightened to his full height, which meant Mira was now staring at approximately the center of his chest. His 4 arms flexed, muscles bunching under scaled skin that looked like it could deflect small arms fire. When he spoke, His voice had dropped to a dangerous rumble. "You dare to insult me? You, a creature from a soft world, presume to challenge a Draxian warrior." He took a step forward, forcing Mira to either hold her ground or back away. "Perhaps you require a lesson in respect, human. Perhaps you need to understand your place in the hierarchy of strength." Mira, demonstrating either remarkable courage or catastrophic stupidity, didn't budge. My place is standing right here, telling you to knock it off and leave the kid alone, not complicated." What happened next occurred with the sort of casual inevitability that characterized most disasters. Vorath, having apparently decided that words were insufficient, reached out with one of his lower right arms and grabbed Mira's wrist. His intention was clear enough to physically remove this irritating human from his presence, perhaps with enough force to send a message about the consequences of impudence. It was a standard Draxian intimidation tactic, one that had worked effectively on dozens of species across hundreds of encounters. Vorath's species had evolved on Draxus Prime, a planet with gravity measuring 1.8 standard. His bones were dense, his muscles were powerful, and his grip could crumple most standard metals. When that four-taloned hand closed around Mira's wrist, he applied what was, by his standards, a moderate amount of pressure, enough to cause pain, to compel compliance, to demonstrate dominance. For approximately 1 second, nothing happened. Then several things occurred in rapid succession. First, Mira's body, operating on reflexes honed by a lifetime lived under Earth's gravity, interpreted the grab as a threat. Her muscles, which had evolved to operate under 1 standard gravity, responded with the sort of instantaneous, violent reaction that Earth's predator-filled evolutionary history had made necessary for survival. Second, she twisted her wrist in a movement that was purely instinctive, a defensive technique that humans had been teaching each other for thousands of years. The movement applied torque to Vorath's overextended arm at an angle his species' physiology wasn't designed to accommodate. Third, and most importantly, physics happened. The sound that echoed through the commissary was distinctive, sharp, and extremely final. It was the sound of Draxian bone-dense, heavy-gravity bone that should have been nearly unbreakable, fracturing under stress it had never been designed to withstand. Then it snapped, completely. Vorath's arm bent at an angle that arms were definitively not supposed to bend, creating a new joint roughly halfway between his elbow and wrist. The taloned hand went instantly slack, releasing Mira's wrist as Vorath's brain struggled to process the information his pain receptors were screaming at him. For a moment, a beautiful, crystalline moment, the universe seemed to pause, as if reality itself was double-checking its calculations. Then Vorath started screaming. It was not a dignified sound. It was the sound of a warrior caste species member discovering that the universe contained surprises, most of them unpleasant. His other 3 arms clutched at the ruined limb as he staggered backward, his legs, those powerful heavy-gravity legs, suddenly unable to support his weight properly. He hit the floor with a crash that rattled tables 3 meters away. The commissary remained silent for perhaps 3 more seconds, every being present staring at the scene before them with the sort of shocked disbelief usually reserved for spontaneous violations of thermodynamics. Mira looked down at her wrist, which bore 4 small pressure marks but was otherwise fine. She looked at Vorath, who was curled on the floor making sounds that the translation implants were wisely declining to process. She looked at her hand, then back at the Draxian, then at the crowd of witnesses. "Huh," she said. This proved to be the catalyst that broke the spell. Suddenly everyone was moving, talking, gesticulating wildly. The Felian service worker fled toward the kitchen. Someone was yelling for medical assistance. A Visian near the back had started recording everything, because of course they had. Station security arrived within minutes, which was impressive. Given that Kelbreth station security usually operated on "eventually we'll get their time." They found Mira standing exactly where she'd been, looking faintly puzzled, while Vorath continued to writhe on the floor, making sounds that suggested his vocabulary of profanity was extensive and creative. The security officer in charge, a professional named Lieutenant Kresh, who'd seen approximately everything the universe had to offer and had been thoroughly unimpressed by most of it, took one look at the scene, and sighed with the particular weariness of someone who knew their shift was about to get exponentially more complicated. "What?" he asked, in the tone of someone who didn't actually want to know but was professionally obligated to ask. "Happened here?" Mira shrugged. "He grabbed me. I pulled away. His arm broke." Kresh stared at her. Then at Vorath. Then back at her. "His arm broke." "Yeah. The Draxian's arm broke. That's what I said." Kresh looked like he wanted to argue this point, but couldn't quite figure out how. Draxians didn't have fragile bones. Draxians had bones that could withstand impacts that would shatter most species' entire skeletal systems. Draxians had bones that had evolved under gravity, so intense it would crush most galactic species into paste. And yet, here was a Draxian, screaming on the floor, with an arm that was very obviously broken in two places. The medical team arrived, a mixed-species group that had seen their share of traumatic injuries, but clearly wasn't prepared for this particular situation. They carefully loaded Vorath onto a stretcher, administered pain medication that eventually reduced his screaming to whimpering, and transported him toward the medical bay while exchanging confused glances. Kresh turned back to Mira. "You're coming with me. We need statements, and probably about 15 different incident reports." He paused. "And maybe a physics consult." The medical bay at Kelbreth Station was a testament to the challenges of multi-species healthcare. It contained treatment pods calibrated for everything from methane breathers to radiation-based life forms, staffed by medical professionals who'd trained in the bewildering variety of anatomies that populated the galaxy. The chief medical officer, Dr. Theln, was a Cortesian, a species known for their analytical minds and complete lack of bedside manner. When Theln examined the scans of Vorath's arm, their three-lobed brain practically vibrated with confusion. "This doesn't make sense," Theln announced to the gathered medical staff, displaying the holographic imaging for everyone to see. "Look at the fracture pattern. This is compression failure combined with torsional stress. The bone didn't break from impact trauma. It broke because something applied force that exceeded its structural tolerance." One of the nurses, a young Felian named Des, who was still shaking from witnessing the incident, raised a tentative hand. "But the human just grabbed his arm and twisted. She barely moved." "Exactly," Theln said, poking at the hologram with one of their 3 fingers. "That's what doesn't make sense. Humans are classified as standard endurance bipeds from a moderate gravity world. Their muscle density is listed as baseline standard. They shouldn't be capable of generating sufficient force to fracture Draxian bone, which has a compression strength rating of, they checked their datapad, 47,000 units per square centimeter." The medical bay fell silent as everyone considered this impossibility. "Pull up the human physiological database," Theln ordered. The database appeared, displaying the collected information on humanity that had been compiled over 15 years of contact. It was, by galactic standards, a reasonably comprehensive file. It listed Earth's gravity as one standard, human bone density as baseline, muscle composition as typical for oxygen-breathing carbon-based life forms. Theln stared at the data for a long moment. Then they did something that would later be described as either brilliant or monumentally stupid. They called Mira Kowalski in for a medical examination. Mira arrived at the medical bay, looking annoyed and slightly defensive. She'd spent the last 2 hours in security giving statements, filling out forms, and explaining repeatedly that she'd just been trying to help and hadn't intended to break anyone's arm. Lieutenant Kresh had seemed skeptical of this defense, possibly because the security footage showed quite clearly that Mira's defensive movement had been executed with the smooth precision of considerable training. "I need to run some scans," Theln announced without preamble. "Non-invasive. Won't hurt, mostly. Mostly. You'll be fine." Theln gestured to an examination pod. Mira, sensing that arguing would be pointless, climbed into the pod. The machinery hummed to life, bathing her in various wavelengths of radiation while computers analyzed the results. Theln watched the data stream past on their display, their expression shifting from clinical interest to confusion to something approaching alarm. "That can't be right," they muttered, adjusting the scanners. "Run it again." The scanners ran again. The results remained unchanged. Thelm pulled up the human physiological database again, comparing it to the actual scan data from the human currently in their examination pod. The discrepancies were, "Doctor, doctor, doctor." One of the nurses ventured. "What is it?" Thelm turned to face their staff, their face doing something complicated. "The database is wrong. Very wrong." They pulled up a comparative display. According to our records, human bone density should be standard baseline approximately 1,850 kilograms per cubic meter. The actual measurement from our scan is 2,100 kilograms per cubic meter. That's a 14% increase over baseline. A data entry error. Someone suggested. I thought so too. But look at the look. Muscle composition. Thelm highlighted another section. Human muscle tissue has a significantly higher mitochondrial density than baseline species. Nearly 30% higher. And the muscle fiber arrangement, it's optimized for explosive force generation in a way that's usually only seen in ambush predators. One of the medical assistants, a Visian, who'd been quietly taking notes, spoke up. But humans are classified as pursuit predators, not ambush hunters. They're classified, Thelm said slowly, as both. Which should have been our first clue. They pulled up Earth's ecological data. Human evolutionary history shows they evolved in an environment with large predators, extreme temperature variations, and scarce resources. They developed endurance, hunting the ability to chase prey for hours or even days until it collapsed from exhaustion. But they also developed the ability to generate sudden, explosive force when necessary. I'm sorry. Mira's voice came from the examination pod, but are you explaining my species to me? Thelm ignored her. And here's the critical piece, Earth's gravity. It's listed as one standard, which we use as our baseline measurement, but look at the actual environmental conditions. They pulled up more data. Earth's surface gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. The standard measure we use for baseline species. That's calibrated based on the average of the 73 founding species of galactic civilization, which includes several species from low-gravity worlds that skewed the average downward. The medical staff stared. Are you saying? The Visian assistant asked carefully, that Earth isn't a moderate gravity world? I'm saying, Thelm replied, that by the standards of most galactic species, Earth is a high-gravity death trap that produced organisms with bone density and muscle composition appropriate for surviving in what they correctly perceived as a hostile environment. They gestured at the scan data. Humans aren't standard endurance bipeds. They're compact bundles of optimization for survival under conditions that most species would consider prohibitively dangerous. Mira had gone very quiet in the examination pod. Can I leave now? She asked, her voice smaller than before. In a moment. Thelm was scrolling through more data, their excitement overriding their usual clinical detachment. This explains so much. Humans have been operating under a significant handicap on our standard gravity stations. On Kelbrith, which maintains 0.9 standard gravity to accommodate the majority of species, humans are essentially performing all physical tasks at 90% of the load they're evolutionarily designed for. They looked at Mira. You must feel almost weightless here. I mean, Mira said, everything's a bit lighter than home. Yeah. Makes the job easier. Easier. Thelm made a sound that might have been laughter or possibly horror. You've been repairing conduits, moving equipment, performing physical labor in an environment where your effective strength is increased by roughly 11%, and no one noticed because everyone assumed humans were weak. I'm not weak, Mira said, with a hint of defensiveness. No, Thelm agreed. You're really not. The implications of this discovery spread through Kelbreth Station with the sort of speed usually associated with scandal or free food. Within hours, every species on the station had heard some version of the story. The human who'd broken a Draxian warrior's arm with a casual defensive move, and the subsequent medical revelation that humans were significantly more dangerous than anyone had previously suspected. The reactions varied by species. The Visians, always pragmatic, immediately revised their threat assessment protocols. The Felians developed a newfound respect for the quiet maintenance technician they'd previously barely noticed. The Cortesians started demanding access to more comprehensive human, physiological data for research purposes. The Draxians, meanwhile, were having something of a collective crisis. Vorath, recovering in the medical bay with his arm in a regeneration cast, had received visits from several members of his delegation. The conversations had been enlightening. It turned out that the Draxian cultural obsession with strength and physical dominance became somewhat problematic when confronted with a species that could casually injure them without apparent effort. The delegation head, a scarred veteran named Korvax Tell, stood beside Vorath's bed and regarded him with an expression that managed to convey both disappointment and grim understanding. "You grabbed her," Korvax said. "I barely applied pressure." Vorath protested weakly. "She shouldn't have been able to. And yet she did." Korvax's voice was flat. "I have reviewed the medical data. I have spoken with the station's chief medical officer. I have compared our physiological standards to theirs." He leaned closer. "Do you understand what this means?" Vorath, still groggy from pain medication, shook his head. "It means," Korvax said slowly, "that humans have been operating in galactic society under a significant self-imposed restraint. It means that when they interact with us, they are being gentle. It means that we have been mistaking their courtesy for weakness." "But they're so small," Vorath objected. "So are thermal detonators." This analogy did not appear to comfort Vorath. Korvax straightened. "The delegation will be issuing a formal apology to the human. You will participate. You will acknowledge your error. And you will learn from this experience, assuming your pride hasn't completely overridden your survival instincts." Vorath wanted to argue, but his arm was still screaming at him despite the pain medication, and arguing suddenly seemed like a very poor life choice. Meanwhile, Mira was discovering that accidentally breaking someone's arm had unexpected consequences for one's social life. She'd returned to her quarters, hoping to process the day's events in peace, only to find that her communicator had exploded with messages. Some were from concerned fellow humans. There were approximately 200 humans scattered across various stations and planets in the sector, and news traveled fast. They wanted to know if she was okay, if she'd been injured, if station security was giving her trouble. Others were from aliens she'd worked with, suddenly viewing her in a new and somewhat nervous light. The Vissian dock supervisor, who'd argued with her about cable management that morning, had sent an apology. The Felian service worker from the commissary had sent a message thanking her profusely and asking if she needed anything. And then there were the job offers. Apparently, multiple security firms had decided that a human who could disable a Draxian warrior might be useful in their employ. The messages ranged from professional to wildly inappropriate, with one particularly bold mercenary company offering what they described as extremely competitive compensation for your combat expertise. Mira deleted that one without responding. She sat on her bunk, staring at the wall of her tiny quarters, and tried to process the fact that her entire existence had shifted in the span of a few hours. She'd come to Kelbreth Station to be a mechanic, to be anonymous, to earn credits and maybe see a bit of the galaxy. Instead, she'd become the human who broke a Draxian's arm, the living proof that humanity was more dangerous than anyone had realized. It was exhausting. Her communicator chimed again. This time it was Lieutenant Kresh. "Kowalski," his message read. "The Draxian delegation wants to meet with you tomorrow. Formal apology, diplomatic protocols, the whole performance. Command is requiring you to attend. Wear something that isn't a maintenance jumpsuit. Try not to break anyone else." Mira groaned and flopped backward on her bunk. The ceiling of her quarters was a dull gray, marked with the occasional water stain and maintenance access panel. It was profoundly uninteresting, which made it perfect for staring at while contemplating how one's life had veered wildly off its expected trajectory. The meeting the next day was held in one of Kelbreth Station's diplomatic conference rooms, a space designed to accommodate multiple species while maintaining an air of solemn formality. Mira arrived wearing her dress uniform, which she'd had to dig out of storage and which still smelled faintly of the packing foam it had been sealed in, and found herself facing the entire Draxian delegation. Korvax stood at the center, flanked by several other imposing figures. Vorath was there too, his arm still in its regeneration cast, looking significantly less confident than he had in the commissary. Mira Kowalski, Korvax began, his voice formal and carefully modulated, on behalf of the Draxian delegation and our people. I offer apology for the actions of Vorath Tel. His behavior was unacceptable. His assumptions were incorrect. His aggression toward you and toward the service worker was inappropriate and violated both station regulations and the basic principles of civilized interaction. Mira blinked. She'd been expecting many things, but a formal apology from a Draxian warrior delegation hadn't been high on the list. Additionally, Korvax continued, we acknowledge that our species' understanding of humanity was flawed and based on incomplete data. We have revised our threat assessment and cultural protocols accordingly. He paused, then added with what might have been the Draxian equivalent of embarrassment, we will endeavor to be more careful in the future. Vorath stepped forward, moving stiffly. I apologize, he said, the words clearly painful for reasons beyond his physical injury. I underestimated you. I assumed weakness where there was strength. This was foolish and has cost me much. He gestured with his good arm at the cast. I hope this injury serves as a reminder to others of my people not to make the same mistake. Mira stood there, feeling deeply awkward, and realized that the entire galaxy was waiting for her response. The diplomatic protocols required her to either accept the apology or reject it, setting a precedent for human-Draxian relations going forward. Apology accepted. She said finally. Just, maybe next time, try asking before grabbing people. Works better than you'd think. The tension in the room eased perceptibly. Korvax inclined his head in what was probably Draxian gratitude, and the meeting concluded with the sort of formal efficiency that suggested everyone involved was relieved it was over. As Mira left the conference room, Lieutenant Kresh fell into step beside her. That went better than expected, he observed. What were you expecting? Honestly, that you'd break someone else's arm just to make a point. He glanced at her. You showed remarkable restraint. I'm a mechanic, not a fighter. I don't go around breaking people's arms for fun. No, Kresh agreed. But you could. That's the part that's making everyone nervous. He stopped at an intersection in the corridor. Word of advice, Kowalski? The galaxy's going to be watching humanity a lot more carefully now. What you proved humans can do that changes things. People are going to be cautious around you. Some will be respectful, others will be afraid. And a few idiots will want to test themselves against you. Great, Mira muttered. That's exactly what I wanted. To be a walking diplomatic incident. Welcome to being a trailblazer. Kresh's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, you handled it well. Better than most would have in your position. He walked away, leaving Mira alone in the corridor. The days that followed were strange in ways that Mira struggled to articulate. The station's population hadn't suddenly started treating her differently on the surface. She still got the same maintenance requests, still crawled through the same access tunnels, still argued with the same Visian supervisor about proper procedure. But there was a difference in the air, subtle but unmistakable. When she walked through the commissary, conversations would pause. When she reached past someone to grab a tool, they'd flinch slightly. The casual disregard she'd experienced as humanity's sole representative on the station had been replaced by something else, wariness. She wasn't sure it was an improvement. 3 weeks after the incident, Mira was working on a stuck valve in Section 12 when her communicator chirped. It was a message from an unfamiliar contact, marked with diplomatic credentials that suggested official business. Miss Kowalski. The message read, I am Ambassador Kellis of the Cortesian Science Directorate. I would like to discuss a matter of some importance regarding humanity's integration into galactic society. Would you be available for a meeting at your earliest convenience? Mira stared at the message, a wrench still in her hand, and felt the universe shifting around her again. An ambassador didn't contact a maintenance technician grade 3 unless something significant was happening. She responded with a time and place, finished fixing the valve, and spent the next 12 hours trying not to worry about what this new development might mean. Ambassador Kellis turned out to be a surprisingly young courtation. Their 3 eyes bright with intelligence and what looked like genuine curiosity rather than the condescension Mira had grown accustomed to from the galaxy's more established species. "Thank you for meeting with me," Kellis said, gesturing for Mira to sit in one of the conference room's adjustable chairs. "I'll be direct, because I suspect you appreciate directness. The incident with Vorathtel has caused what we might politely call a reassessment of humanity's capabilities and threat level." "I noticed," Mira said dryly. "Yes, well, you're not the subtle type, are you?" Kellis pulled up a holographic display showing various data points. Mira said, "The Science Directorate has been reviewing all available information on Earth and human physiology. We've discovered that the initial contact team's assessment was, let's say, optimistic about humanity's similarities to baseline galactic species." "We're not that different," Mira protested. "You evolved under conditions that most galactic species would consider a high-gravity hell world," Kellis countered. "You possess bone density that exceeds most warrior caste species. Your muscle composition suggests optimization for both endurance and explosive force generation. Your cardiovascular system is absurdly over-engineered for your size. And perhaps most concerning, you have a documented tendency toward aggression when threatened, combined with sophisticated pattern recognition abilities and tool use that puts you firmly in the apex predator category." Mira shifted uncomfortably. "When you put it like that, it sounds like humanity is terrifying." "Yes." Kellis leaned forward. "But here's the interesting part. Despite all of this, humans have been operating in galactic society for 15 years without major incident. You integrate well. You follow social protocols. You show restraint. Most species with your capabilities would have tried to carve out territory or demonstrate dominance. Humans seem content to fix things and ask questions. Is there a point to this?" Mira asked, though she suspected she knew where this was going. "The point," Kellis said, "is that the galactic community needs to update its understanding of humanity. And I've been tasked with helping facilitate that process. Which means gathering more accurate data, establishing better diplomatic protocols, and most importantly making sure that incidents like the one with Vorath don't escalate into larger conflicts." "You want me to be some kind of what? Ambassador?" "No. You're a mechanic, and from what I understand, you're good at it." Kellis smiled, which looked unsettling on a courtation face. "I want you to keep being yourself, but I'd like to document your experiences, gather your insights, and use that information to help the rest of the galaxy understand what humans are actually like when they're not being underestimated or provoked." Mira thought about this. About the past 3 weeks of careful interactions and nervous glances. About the way the galaxy had suddenly decided she was dangerous just because she'd defended herself using reflexes that any human would have in the same situation. "Will it help?" she asked finally. "Help what?" "Help people understand that we're not trying to be threatening? That we're just us." Kellis considered this. "I believe so. Understanding tends to reduce fear. And fear, Miss Kowalski, is what causes most conflicts in the galaxy." "All right," Mira said. "I'll help. But I'm not giving up my day job. I wouldn't dream of asking you to." Over the following months, Mira's life developed a strange duality. By day, she remained a maintenance technician, crawling through access tunnels and arguing about proper procedure. But several times a week, she met with Ambassador Kellis to discuss human psychology, retry 2C continue edit physiology, culture, and the 1,000 small details that made humanity distinct from the galaxy's other civilizations. The information gathered from these sessions was compiled into what Kellis called the Revised Human Assessment Document, a comprehensive file that corrected the numerous errors and assumptions in the original contact reports. It covered everything, from accurate bone density measurements to the psychological concept of fairness that seemed hardwired into human social behavior, to the peculiar human tendency to adopt basically anything as a pet given sufficient time and opportunity. The document was distributed throughout the Galactic Diplomatic Corps with a priority classification that suggested someone, somewhere, had decided that understanding humanity was suddenly very important. Mira watched this unfold with a mixture of bemusement and resignation. She'd come to Kelbreth Station to be anonymous, to be just another worker in the vast machinery of galactic commerce. Instead, she'd become a case study, a living example of why assumptions about species' capabilities could be dangerously wrong. But there were unexpected benefits. The Felian service worker from the commissary, whose name turned out to be Rena, had started occasionally joining Mira for meals. Their conversations were awkward at first, marked by Rena's lingering nervousness and Mira's uncertainty about how to interact with someone who seemed to view her as some kind of protective figure. But gradually, something like friendship developed. "You know," Rena said one day, picking at what passed for salad in the commissary, "before the incident, I thought humans were just background noise. Another species. Not important." She glanced up, her large eyes apologetic. "I'm sorry. That sounds terrible." "It's honest," Mira replied. "And probably what most species thought. But now everyone's talking about how humans are secretly dangerous. How Earth is a death world. How you could snap any of us in half if you wanted to." Rena paused. "It's making some people paranoid." I noticed. Mira had indeed noticed the way certain species now gave her a wider berth in the corridors, the way conversations would stop when she entered a room. "I'm not dangerous. I'm just a mechanic." "You broke Vorath's arm. He grabbed me first. I was defending myself." "I know." Rena smiled slightly. "That's what makes it interesting. You didn't attack him. You didn't threaten him. You just reacted. And your reaction was enough to break a Draxian warrior's arm." She shook her head. "It makes me wonder what humans are like when they're actually trying to hurt someone. Hopefully you'll never have to find out." The conversation moved on to safer topics, but the question lingered in Mira's mind. What were humans like when they were actually dangerous? When they stopped being gentle, stopped self-regulating their strength, stopped operating under the assumption that everyone else was as durable as they were? She thought about Earth's history, the wars, the conflicts, the endless cycle of violence that humanity had inflicted upon itself before reaching for the stars. She thought about the fact that humans had developed weapons capable of rendering their own planet uninhabitable, had stared into that abyss, and had somehow managed to step back from the edge. The galaxy saw humans as accidentally dangerous, as creatures who could hurt others without meaning to. But Mira knew the darker truth. Humans were also deliberately dangerous when circumstances required it. They just learned, over thousands of years of painful history, to restrain that capacity. It was a lesson the galaxy was still learning. 6 months after the incident, Kelbreth Station received an unusual delegation. The Veronthi Collective, a coalition of species from the core worlds, had sent a diplomatic envoy to discuss establishing more formal relations with humanity. Earth's government had dispatched its own representatives, 3 humans, who arrived on a transport ship with all the efficiency and barely contained chaos that seemed to characterize human endeavors. Mira was requested, not required, but strongly encouraged to attend the initial reception. She showed up in her dress uniform again, feeling awkward and out of place among the actual diplomats and their entourages. The Veronthi delegates were Vishan, Cortesian, and a species called the Pelexian that Mira hadn't encountered before. They were tall, willowy beings with iridescent skin and an air of carefully cultivated superiority that suggested they considered themselves several rungs above everyone else on the evolutionary ladder. The human delegation consisted of Ambassador Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, Dr. Okonkwo, a xenobiologist who looked like he'd rather be in a lab, and Commander Hayes, a military attaché whose presence suggested Earth was taking this meeting very seriously. The reception proceeded with all the formal tedium that diplomatic events required. Speeches were made. Pleasantries were exchanged. Cultural gifts were presented with appropriate ceremony. Mira stood near the back, trying to be unobtrusive, and wondered why she'd been asked to attend. Then the Palexian delegate, a tall male whose name the translation implants rendered as something like Counselor Varish, addressed the human delegation directly. "We are pleased to formalize relations with your species," Varish said, his tone managing to convey that he was pleased in the same way one might be pleased about successfully training a particularly clever animal. "Though we must admit, the recent revelations about human physiology have caused some concern in the collective." Ambassador Chen's expression didn't change, but Mira caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Concerns. Your species is significantly more capable of violence than initial assessments suggested," Varish continued. "The incident here on Kelbreth Station demonstrated that clearly. It raises questions about humanity's suitability for full integration into galactic society." The room had gone very quiet. Commander Hayes stepped forward, his posture suggesting military precision barely contained beneath diplomatic courtesy. "With respect, Counselor, humanity has been part of galactic society for 15 years without major incident. One defensive action by a civilian doesn't constitute a pattern of violence." "Perhaps," Varish replied, "but it demonstrates potential. And potential, Commander, is what concerns the collective. You evolved on a world that, by our standards, is prohibitively hostile. You possess physical capabilities that exceed most species, including several warrior castes. And your history suggests a troubling capacity for self-destructive behavior and internecine conflict. Our history," Ambassador Chen said quietly, "also demonstrates our capacity for cooperation, innovation, and restraint. Yes, humans can be dangerous. So can most species when circumstances require it. The question isn't whether we have the capacity for violence, it's whether we have the wisdom to control it." "Wisdom." Varish managed to make the word sound like an insult. "Your species has been spacefaring for barely a century. You have no deep history of peaceful coexistence with other sentient species. You are in essence, children playing with power you don't fully understand." Mira felt anger flare in her chest. She'd spent 6 months dealing with the aftermath of accidentally breaking someone's arm, 6 months of being treated like a potential threat, 6 months of the galaxy deciding that humanity was dangerous, based on one incident and incomplete data. And now this pompous alien was standing in front of actual human diplomats and basically calling them children. She took a step forward, before her brain could overrule the decision. "Counselor Varish," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent reception hall. "I'm Mira Kowalski. I'm the human who broke the Draxian's arm." Every eye in the room turned to her. Ambassador Chen's expression suggested she was either impressed by this boldness or planning Mira's court-martial, possibly both. Varish regarded her with interest. "Ah, the incident's catalyst. How appropriate." "I didn't mean to hurt him," Mira continued, ignoring the diplomatic protocols she was almost certainly violating. "I was defending myself using reflexes I've had since childhood. I didn't know I could break his arm. I didn't want to break his arm. It happened because there was a mismatch between what he thought I was capable of and what I actually was. And this is supposed to be reassuring?" "No," Mira said. "It's supposed to be honest. The galaxy made assumptions about humans based on incomplete data and surface observations. We let those assumptions stand because we were new here and didn't want to cause problems. But here's the thing, Counselor, humans have been gentle. We've been careful. We've been restraining ourselves to fit into a galactic society that classified us as weak and harmless." She stepped closer, aware that she was probably ending her career on Kelbreth Station, but unable to stop. "You're worried about human potential for violence? That's fair. We have that potential. But we also have thousands of years of experience learning to control it, to channel it, to choose when to use it and when to hold back. Vorath grabbed me, expecting an easy victim. He got someone who defended herself on pure instinct. If I'd been actively trying to hurt him, if I'd been using even a fraction of deliberate force instead of just reacting, he'd be in much worse shape." The room was utterly silent now. "So yes," Mira finished, "humans can be dangerous. But we choose not to be most of the time. We choose to fix things instead of breaking them, to build instead of destroying, to ask questions instead of making demands. That's not weakness, counselor. That's wisdom. And maybe that's something your collective should think about before judging species you don't actually understand. She stepped back, suddenly aware that she'd just delivered an angry speech to a diplomatic envoy in front of multiple ambassadors, and probably violated about 17 different protocols in the process. Ambassador Chen was staring at her with an expression that was impossible to read. Commander Hayes looked like he was trying not to smile. Dr. Okonkwo had pulled out a datapad and was taking notes. And Counselor Varesh was regarding her with something that might have been surprise or possibly respect. You are correct, he said finally. The collective has made assumptions. Perhaps we have allowed caution to become prejudice. He inclined his head slightly. Your words are noted, Miss Kowalski, and will be shared with the collective's leadership. The reception continued after that, though the atmosphere had shifted. Delegates, who'd been watching the humans with wary calculation, were now watching with something closer to genuine interest. The Palexian delegation engaged in actual conversation rather than condescending pleasantries, and Ambassador Chen, when she finally managed to corner Mira near the refreshment table, simply said, "That was either brilliant or career-ending. We'll find out which tomorrow." It turned out to be brilliant, though Mira suspected that had more to do with timing and circumstances than her actual speech. The Varanthi collective revised their assessment of humanity following the reception, acknowledging that their initial concerns had been based on incomplete understanding. They didn't suddenly declare humans to be perfect galactic citizens, but they did recognize that humanity's capacity for restraint was as significant as its capacity for force. Other species followed suit. The revised human assessment document that Ambassador Kellis had compiled became required reading for diplomatic corps throughout the galaxy. Universities began offering courses in human psychology and culture, and slowly, gradually, the initial panic about humans being accidentally dangerous evolved into something more nuanced. Humans were capable, yes. Physically powerful for their size, yes. But they were also cooperative, creative, and generally inclined towards solving problems rather than creating them. They made good engineers, decent diplomats, and perhaps most importantly reliable allies who understood the value of restraint. Mira watched this shift happen from her position on Kelbreth Station, where she continued her work as a maintenance technician. Her brief moment of diplomatic fame faded, as these things do, replaced by newer scandals and crises that captured the galaxy's attention. She returned to her access tunnels and power conduits, to arguments with Vissian supervisors and meals in the commissary with Rena. But things had changed in subtle ways that took time to fully appreciate. When she walked through the station now, people nodded to her not with fear, but with something closer to respect. When she worked alongside aliens of various species, they treated her as a colleague rather than an oddity. The casual dismissal she'd experienced in her early months on the station had been replaced by genuine regard. One day, nearly a year after the incident with Vorath, Mira was working on a particularly stubborn coolant leak when her communicator chimed. It was Lieutenant Kresh. Kowalski, got a situation in the commissary. Need you down here. Mira felt her stomach drop. What kind of situation? The diplomatic kind. Just get down here. She arrived at the commissary to find a scene that was eerily familiar. A crowd of onlookers maintaining careful distance from a confrontation in progress. This time, though, the participants were different. A Kelreth trader, one of the insectoid species from the Outer Rim, was having a heated argument with a Draxian. Not Vorath. This was a younger warrior, probably new to the station. And standing between them, hands raised in a calming gesture, was Rena. Mira pushed through the crowd, catching fragments of the argument as she moved. Something about a trade dispute, accusations of cheating, threats of violence, the usual nonsense that happened when different species tried to conduct business while operating under different cultural assumptions about fairness and honor. Don't care about your customs. The Draxian was snarling at the Kelreth. You attempted to defraud me, and I will have satisfaction. I followed all proper protocols. Kelreth clicked back. Your ignorance of standard trading practices is not my concern. The Draxian's forearms were tensing, muscles bunching in preparation for violence. The Kelreth was backing away but had nowhere to go, cornered against a table, and Rena was trying desperately to mediate, her voice high with stress. Please, let's all just calm down. And the Draxian moved suddenly, one arm swinging toward the Kelreth in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture, but would probably result in actual injury. And then Mira was there, her hand catching the Draxian's wrist mid-swing with the sort of casual precision that suggested she'd done this before. The commissary went silent. The Draxian froze, staring at the human who'd just stopped his strike as easily as someone might catch a thrown ball. His eyes widened as he recognized what she was, processed the implications, and very carefully did not attempt to pull away. "Hi," Mira said pleasantly. "Let's not do this, okay? Trading disputes go through arbitration. Violence gets you ejected from the station. And trust me when I say you don't want to test whether you can take me in a fight, because I promise you the answer is no, and the consequences are medical bills you can't afford." The Draxian's four eyes darted between Mira's face and his captured wrist. Very slowly, very carefully, he relaxed his aggressive posture. "You are the human from the incident." "That's right. And you know what I learned from that incident? That breaking people's arms causes a lot of paperwork and diplomatic headaches." She released his wrist. "So how about we skip that part and go straight to the part where you both file complaints with station arbitration like civilized beings?" The Draxian stepped back, all four arms now held in a neutral position that suggested complete abandonment of violence as a solution. Yes. Arbitration. That would be acceptable." The Kelreth, who'd been watching this exchange with a jangted, sort of intense focus that suggested he was recalculating his entire understanding of interspecies power dynamics, clicked his agreement. "Arbitration is acceptable." Lieutenant Kresh stepped forward, having watched the entire thing with professional interest. "Right then. Both of you, with me. We'll sort this out properly." He glanced at Mira. "Thanks for the assist, Kowalski." As the crowd dispersed and the commissary returned to normal operation, Renner approached Mira with an expression that mixed gratitude and amusement. "You know," she said, "when I first met you, I thought you were just a quiet maintenance worker. Now I'm pretty sure you're the scariest person on this station." "I'm not scary," Mira protested. "I'm just competent. Competent at breaking arms. It was one time that everyone knows about. You're basically a legend now." Rena smiled. "The human who proved we've all been underestimating your species. The civilian who changed galactic diplomatic protocols. The mechanic who scares Draxian warriors." Mira groaned. "That's not how I want to be remembered." "Too late. You're famous." Rena's expression softened. "But for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. Things are safer with you around." They sat down at one of the commissary tables, and the conversation shifted to more mundane topics: work schedules, the questionable food options, station gossip. Around them, the life of Kelbreth Station continued its chaotic flow, dozens of species interacting in the complicated dance of galactic civilization. And Mira, sitting there with something that might actually be a friend, realized that despite everything, the incident, the attention, the way her simple desire for anonymity had been thoroughly demolished, she was okay with how things had turned out. She'd come to the galaxy, hoping to be invisible, to be just another worker among thousands. Instead, she'd become a symbol, a reminder that assumptions about species capabilities could be dangerously wrong, that gentle behavior shouldn't be mistaken for weakness, and that humans were more complicated than initial assessments suggested. It wasn't what she'd planned, but then again, very little in life went according to plan. She finished her meal, said goodbye to Rena, and headed back to her quarters. Tomorrow there would be more conduits to repair, more arguments with supervisors, more of the routine work that made up the vast majority of her existence. The galaxy would keep spinning, new crises would develop and resolve, and gradually the memory of the incident would fade into just another story that people told about the early days of human integration. But the lesson would remain. Humans were not what the galaxy had assumed them to be. They were stronger, more dangerous, and more capable than initial assessments suggested. But they were also more controlled, more cooperative, and more committed to peaceful coexistence than their physical capabilities might indicate. They were, in other words, exactly what they'd always been: complicated, contradictory, and constantly surprising. And the galaxy, whether it liked it or not, was going to have to adjust its expectations accordingly. 3 years later, Mira received a message from Ambassador Chen. It was brief and to the point. Thought you'd like to know humanity just got approved for full membership in the Galactic Union. Thanks for helping make that possible. Your accidental diplomacy worked. Mira read the message twice, then looked around her quarters on Kelbreth Station. They were still small, still cramped, still decorated with nothing but functional furniture and the occasional maintenance manual. But they were home, in the way that places become home when you've lived in them long enough. She composed a response. Glad I could help. Still just fixing things and trying not to break anyone's arms. Kowalski out. She sent the message, shut down her communicator, and went to bed. Outside, in her window, Kelbreth Station continued its slow rotation through the void, a tiny point of light and life in the vast darkness of space. Inside its corridors, thousands of beings from dozens of species lived, worked, argued, and occasionally learned to understand each other a little better. And somewhere in the station's maintenance section, a human mechanic slept peacefully, unaware that she'd become part of the galaxy's history. Or perhaps she was aware, and simply didn't care. After all, conduits didn't fix themselves, and someone had to make sure the air kept circulating, and the lights stayed on, and the station kept functioning, despite the chaos. It was steady work, important work. The kind of work that didn't require breaking anyone's arms or giving impromptu diplomatic speeches or becoming the living embodiment of humanity's unexpected capabilities. Most of the time, anyway. And really, Mira thought, as she drifted off to sleep, that was all anyone could ask for: the chance to do good work, to help when needed, and to occasionally remind the universe that assumptions about capability were just that, assumptions.